Good evening, comrades. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us in today's episode of Lives of the Left. We're having a second bite of the cherry with McShane, who's joining us again from Ireland. She's looking at the Bolshevik woman, Alexandra Kollontai, who was a very interesting woman for all sorts of reasons. She was actually the first woman in history to ever have an official, to be a member of a government in the world. That's pretty interesting about her. She actually was a member of the Mensheviks for a while before she joined the Bolshevik party, etc. So lots of interesting things about her, and I won't jabber away for too much longer. Thank you, Anne, for joining us.
Okay. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, comrades. So Alexandra Kollontai is, as Tina has indicated, probably the best known member of the socialist and communist women's movement. And everybody knows something about her. You know, usually I've told people, you know, that I'm working on the early Soviet women's movement. They say, oh, Kollontai and all that. And I say, yeah, Kollontai and all that. So on Kollontai and all that, tonight, I'm just really going to pick out some themes that I think are useful to consider her and her role in politics of the early 20th century and the contribution that she made. So I'm not going to go and look at her childhood or any, you know, of her connections with the men in her life. You can find out about that if you want. You can look at various biographies of her by Kathy Porter and Barbara Evans and many others who've written about her and her relationship with men in particular. But I'm not really going to deal with that because I don't think it's what's important for us in examining her life. So what I wanted to say firstly about her is that in a way I really don't think that we should consider her just as an individual. And I think it's a pity that history and our movement has treated her as such, because many times people think that she was the central person in the Russian movement, or that she was the only person really in the Russian movement. And I've read a number of articles where she's been credited with doing things that she absolutely didn't do. But I think it's much better to look at her as somebody who was part of a team of women, a group of women in both the Socialist International, of the Socialist Women's International, which existed between 1907 and 1915, and the Communist Women's International, which came into being in 1920 and was closed down in 1930. Obviously, there's periods in between, but the individuals that she worked with were those same individuals that were involved in creating those organizations. So, okay, so firstly, her first involvement with politics came after she was married. Kollontai was her married name, and although she and her husband divorced, she kept that name for the entirety of her life, despite the fact she married on a second occasion to Dubenko in the period following the Russian Revolution. So she visited factories with her husband as he was an industrialist in the 1890s, and she was quite shocked at the conditions that she saw there. And also, she was somebody who really couldn't come to terms with married life. So she was married into a bourgeois family. Her own family were a bourgeois family. And what was expected of her as a bourgeois woman were to do charity work and basically look pretty and tell the servants, you know, what to do. Anyway, she wasn't happy with that. She really wanted to be involved in politics. And with the support of her father, which in itself is unusual, she went off to Zurich in around 1898, 1897, 1898. And she went there to study Marxism. And this was as some of you may know, Zurich was an important place at that period for communists and for socialists, particularly in Russia, because Switzerland appears to have had quite a liberal regime, and whereas in Russia, the organizations like the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democrats, were largely illegal for the majority of their existence. Here in Zurich, it was possible to be far more open. So she went there and she studied. And when she was there, she came across Clara Zetkin's journal, Die Gleichheit. Apparently, Rosa Luxemburg had been there and had left a stack of the journals. So that's how she came to know Die Gleichheit, which, as you've already heard about from Ben Lewis recently, was the journal that was edited by Clara Zetkin. And through the journal, she became connected with Clara Zetkin and the German Social Democratic Party. And she became connected with their women's movement, which was the Frauenbewegung. And she was asked by Clara Zetkin to attend some of their conferences. So she attended conferences of the German women's movement in the 1890s, and she began to develop her ideas from that period. So basically, this indicates that her primary interest was Marxism. She saw herself primarily as a Marxist, and then she became more aware of and interested in the woman question through reading Zetkin's journal and the writings, obviously, of other women and men in that journal. So she began to attend their events, and then she would go back to Russia. She went back to Russia after Zurich, and she became involved in the Russian Social Democratic Party at this stage, and began to argue for her views within it. But it wasn't really until 1905, when she was in Russia during the period of the 1905 revolution, that she became most aware of the necessity to create an organization to develop and support women and raise the woman question within the socialist and communist movement. So she was in Russia in the period of 1905, and she was present at the Bloody Sunday demonstration, which is famously known for having been shot on by the Tsarist guards, and was led by Father Gapon, the priest who I think he himself was also killed on that day. So this event in January 1905 signaled the beginning of the revolution of that period. And Kollontai became aware of the fact that there were a tremendous number of women involved in this struggle, and that women had been becoming more and more militant since they were drawn into production in St. Petersburg. Mainly she was involved in St. Petersburg, but obviously to a lesser extent in Moscow. So Russian capitalism in the period, the 1880s and 1890s, had a boom, and lots of peasants were drawn off the land into the cities, and men and women generally lived separately. The men lived in billets, and they got paid, I think, in the taverns and the pubs, and there was a big drinking culture among them, and women were separate from them, and women generally worked in the textile industries. Anyway, they were not unionized by and large, but they were very militant, and there were many actions, walkouts, took place through that period, and was increasingly a political awareness, but again, it wasn't organized. There were times when men and women did take action together, but because they weren't unionized, because they lived separately, because they generally worked in separate factories, it was difficult to coalesce. So in 1905, after she saw what was happening, she argued among her comrades in the St. Petersburg committee of the RSDRP for them to set up a special section to work among women. And this was rebuffed, and she was accused of feminism. She, in fact, I suppose I should say now, I know she has been described as a feminist by many writers, but I think she most certainly was not a feminist. She was a fighter for women's liberation, and she saw it coming through Marxism and through the work of men and women together, the recognition of the importance of women's liberation for socialism and the development of organization as part of the organization of our class. So not something separate to be added on, but something that was implicit and necessary. Anyway, because I said that now because she also had a history of being the scourge of the feminist movement in Russia at the time. And obviously what she was talking about at the time was the bourgeois feminist movement, although it wasn't all the ladies. There were other elements in it, like radical elements, the nihilists, you know, there were kind of parts of it that went on to be involved in the cadets, which was something maybe a little bit like the Labour Party, but, you know, kind of reformist organization in Russian terms at the time. But in any event, she directed a lot of her anger at the feminist movement because they were organizing women in parts of St. Petersburg where the socialists and communists should have been organizing them. And she was stuck, and you'll see, or maybe, I don't know whether Ben mentioned it, but you see it replicated in the experiences of every woman, socialist or communist at the time, that if they weren't feminists, and they said they weren't feminists and they wanted the socialist movement to take up the question, they were often criticized as feminists by the movement, by our movement, and you know, rebuffed by feminists as basically as being soft on the socialists, and they didn't want to organize with the feminists, but they were stuck in the middle. I haven't described that very well, but they were stuck in between the two. So anyway, so she had a two-pronged approach. She fought for a separate organization to bring together the women in St. Petersburg and other cities in Russia, and she also fought the feminist attempts to organize them. This culminated in a conference that took place in 1908, an All-Russian Women's Congress, where Kollontai did manage to get the RSDRP to send a delegation of women workers that went there. And this event was a very stormy one because it was an attempt to create a united bourgeois women's movement in Russia that would include all sections of society and obviously working class women as well. And they intervened in that. The workers group intervened in that. They had been coached by Kollontai in the weeks leading up to it, and they intervened in it and disrupted it, eventually leading to the whole event collapsing. You can read various accounts of what happened at that, but she certainly saw it as a positive event in that it created for the first time a distinction. A line was drawn between the bourgeois women's movement and the working class women's movement. She also had, in fact, set up for a brief period a women's organization in St. Petersburg with women like Claudia Nikolaeva, who was one of her supporters. Anyway, so I suppose just to summarize that part of it, she had tried to set up this separate organization, and although something did come into place for a short period of time under her leadership, it wasn't able to continue, particularly as she left Russia in 1908 because there was a warrant out for her arrest. And she went to Germany. And in Germany, she began to work with Zetkin again, and indeed had been working with her before then. So okay, so I'm just going to move on now to look at the experience in the Second International. So a year before she had to leave Russia, Kollontai began working with Clara Zetkin in creating a women's section of the Socialist International. And this came into being and was adopted by the Socialist International itself. And its main focus when it began work was around the question of winning the vote for women, all women, and for the workers' movement to take up that question. It also had other demands around the 8-hour day, but the biggest struggle that took place politically within the International was around the vote. And the struggle was ranged from the delegates from England, which would have been the Fabians and some others who believed that they should work with the feminist movement in Britain and take a step-by-step approach. So first, women with a certain income, with a high income, would get the vote, and then the others would follow. In Austria, they were dealing with the other end of the extreme, in that their call was for working class men to get the vote first before working class women. So they argued with both sides, and eventually at the meeting that was held of the Socialist Women's Secretariat, they won that vote. And they presented the vote, they presented the resolution to the Socialist International afterwards, and it was voted through. But despite the fact that it was formally voted through, the problems continued. Like, women were seen as backward, and some in the socialist movement didn't want women to get the vote because they thought that if they got the vote that they would prefer candidates of the right wing. So, there was a lot of prejudice towards women. Women were considered to be fundamentally backward and conservative, whereas because they were generally at home or not organized if they were in the workplace, whereas men were in the unions and in the political organizations. But anyway, again, in 1910, they came back to the question, and on this occasion, the SPD delegation put forward the motion to the conference, to the Congress, I should say, and on that occasion, it was voted through again, and I think they began to have perhaps more success, but of course then came the war, and things went, everything went downhill, I suppose you could say. But I would say that the question of the vote at the time wasn't just a question of reforms. They believed that by arguing for the vote for working class women, they would bring women into politics in a manner which was revolutionary, because this question of democracy and having a voice connected with so much of their lives, because of their oppression, because they didn't have a political voice, and gaining a political voice would bring women, and the socialist movement arguing and fighting for that would mean that women would crowd into the socialist movement, and it would become, greatly strengthened by this and transform itself overnight and give it far more power to change society. Anyway, I don't think that they were successful ultimately, certainly not to the extent that they wanted to be, because they returned to the question again after the Russian Revolution in the form of the Communist Women's International. So, okay, so in fact, although the war broke out and the movement was rent asunder by the opportunism of the leadership of the SPD, and then the Socialist International itself was rent by division and collapsed, the Socialist Women's International retained some semblance of organization. And in fact, in 1915, they held a conference in Bern to discuss the question of war. And I think it wasn't really until that stage that any of the Bolshevik women, because as Tina said, Kollontai wasn't a member of the Bolsheviks until actually 1915. She joined then, and it was at that stage that Ines Armand, who's another famous woman, she began to be involved, and she was present at that event. Although I don't know why, but Kollontai wasn't there. But it's an important event because it showed that although damage had been done, the Socialist Women's International had retained its organizational form, and the demands that they were discussing at that conference were against the war. Now, we can talk about Zetkin's views on that question. I think that she kind of veered a bit towards pacifism, and you perhaps have heard of Lenin's intervention at the conference where he wasn't able to go because it was women only, and he was trying to organize the Bolshevik intervention through Ines Armand, and anyway, they weren't successful with their demands, but they eventually compromised. But it was still a positive event because it was the only event of that period before the later conferences of communists in the run-up to the Russian Revolution. It was the first event which spoke out against the war. Kollontai actually herself became a supporter of Lenin during the war, and she spent a lot of time in Norway and in Sweden organizing there. So she traveled around a lot in that period, trying to win support for Lenin's position. And she returned to Russia in early 1917 after the news of the first Russian Revolution came out. She was back there, I believe, before Lenin, and she was a strong supporter of Lenin's position on revolutionary defeatism, I should say, revolutionary defeatism, and a strong supporter throughout that period. So, okay, where am I?
And do you want to quickly explain revolutionary defeatism in 2 sentences?
Okay, so revolutionary defeatism was a policy which Lenin developed. I think it didn't exactly take shape during the Second International, but it was being developed in that period. Anyway, basically, the idea of revolutionary defeatism was that in a war between your own bourgeoisie and another, that you take the opportunity to fight for working class revolution or working class progress in overthrowing capitalism. So the argument in that period was that rather than the working class lining up on the side of their own bourgeoisie, be it Britain, be it Germany, be it Russia, that they should use the opportunity to make revolution.
The main enemy is at home.
Exactly, the main enemy is at home. Exactly. So, I mean, if you look actually at Lenin's letters to Kollontai during that period, you'll see, the kind of the tenor of it all, the urgency of it all. Like he's giving her instructions to go and speak to this person, that person. They're just organizing to try and reach out to as many people as possible to try to build their forces for a third, for a voice in amongst all of the voices of patriotic voices and pacifist voices, for a strand that was for revolution, taking the opportunity of revolution in that period to be heard. So was that clear enough?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Okay, so I feel like I may be rattling along a bit too quickly. So, okay, so there was the Russian Revolution, there was February when the women came out, and after the first stage of the revolution, when the Tsar was overthrown and the provisional government was in power, the journal Rabotnitsa, which had been set up for a brief period in 1914, which Kollontai wasn't involved in, anyway, but it was relaunched. And this journal began to organize women in Russia during the periods of the year of revolution and activity. And it began to organize women on the basis of setting up social forms of care for children, collective laundry facilities, canteens, etc. So one thing I haven't said, and I should have, was that the basis of the idea of women's liberation through socialism came from the concept of being able to change society so that women's place became a very different one than it was under capitalism. And the ideas of Friedrich Engels and August Bebel, as developed by Zetkin and Kollontai and others, were that basically that society has to take on the tasks that are today dealt with in the private family, and that the questions of childcare and women having babies, caring for the family, all these questions were questions that need to be socialized so that society itself would take on these questions and women could be free and able to attend meetings, work, do whatever they wanted to do to the same extent as men did or do, and have freedom and autonomy in life, and that in a society where these tasks are socialized, that the whole place of women would be very different to what it was under capitalism and continues to be today under capitalism, which is, primarily responsible for childcare, looking after the family, having babies, and all the disadvantages and prejudices that goes with that. So, that was their perspective, that was their program. So they began to develop that program throughout that year, and they were winning over women to the Bolsheviks on the basis that the Bolshevik Revolution would bring equality for women. So, therefore, anyway, the revolution took place, and Kollontai was appointed as the Commissar for Social Welfare in the aftermath of the revolution, and she was, as Tina said, therefore the first minister of any government ever in the world. And
female, yeah, female.
Should I say
female minister?
Okay.
With the female,
not first minister. First, thank you, Tina. First female minister of any government in the world. And she used her position in that to develop some of the first decrees made by the Soviet government. Obviously, she was working with other people, and she also used the conferences of women, working class and peasant women. The first conference was in November 1917, which was organized by Rabotnitsa, and she put a number of resolutions to that conference which were agreed, and then they became the decrees on marriage and divorce and maternity and women's equality under law, position in the workplace, maternity leave, all of these issues that were first announced, divorce, of course, free divorce on demand, all of these unprecedented laws that were brought into being in late 1917 and 1918 were initiated in part by her working with lawyers, and also they were, which is fundamental, they were presented to the women's conferences and agreed by them before they were finally signed off on by the government. So after that conference in late 1917, the Civil War obviously broke out, and many of the plans that they had for future conferences didn't come to anything. In late 1917, Kollontai again put to the women at the conference that they should form a separate organization to fight for women's rights within the party. And they decided that they didn't want to do that because they were worried about the possibility that they would be seen as splitters or feminists. And also they were worried that all the questions to do with women's emancipation would be left to them and they would be marginalized. But in fact, that's what happened anyway in 1918. So in 1918, the war was going on. The majority of male workers were signed up to the Red Army, and women were left to run the factories. I mean, some towns were almost all women workers in that period. So run the factories, look after the children, and it was a time of spiraling price rises and other problems. So it was very tough. Women began to complain to the leaders to the women's leaders about what was happening, and that they felt that they'd been left down, and that basically the support for the Bolsheviks that had been so high during 1917 before the revolution was dropping at a great rate. So in November 1918, Kollontai and the other women, Ines Armand, Nikolaeva, Samilova, there are lots of them. There's, I suppose, maybe about 10 of them were the core. They came together, had another conference, organized another conference, which was really huge. It was a delegate conference, and the women came from right throughout the Russian state, peasant women, from as far away as Azerbaijan, right up to, the local women, and they came to Moscow. And at that event, they demanded real change. And one of those demands actually was abortion. I'm actually writing on that question at the moment about abortion in the early Soviet Union. But there were also other demands around rights in the workplace, social welfare, support for women's cooperatives, all sorts of other issues were raised. And it was decided at that stage that they needed to form an organization to work specifically among women and to raise women's issues within the party, and to be a voice for women in the party, as well as being a voice for the party among women. So in the following September, that group of women who had formed the first commissions, women's commissions, that became the official Zhenotdel, which is the women's department of the Communist Party, of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So, okay, so I'm kind of giving you a potted history, really, of all of the work that she was involved in. And I'm doing that to show that she really wasn't alone. I mean, sometimes she's seen as a utopian, and indeed some of the things that she wrote in the early days of the revolution are quite utopian. She wrote about the possibility of all relationships being relationships of friendship and love, about the state dictating the terms of relationships. I mean, she did tend to confuse the Soviet state with the future commune. She was very enthusiastic about the fact that many relationships had begun to change, and that men and women no longer lived together, and that women, basically were living independently. This had its negative side, though, that she never conceded and was raised by others like Nadezhda Krupskaya, in that, in a way, the things that Kollontai was arguing for, and in a way, many of the things that the Zhenotdel were doing were difficult to achieve in a society which could not kind of provide the resources necessary to really socialize childcare, food provision, you know, and all of the other things that were needed in order for women to be free from housework. And I think that partly because she wrote on these questions in this way, kind of pushing for changes in family life, pushing for changes between men and women, new relationships to develop, that she was sort of, they were able to pick her off, the bureaucracy that didn't like her, were able to pick her off because of this. She became the leader of the Jean Hôtel in 1919, after the death of Inessa Armand that year. And at this stage, things weren't going well with the Civil War, and there were being cutbacks made by the government in relation to, you know, the women's, the programs that they were running and the funding for cooperatives. But she refused to give up, and she refused to back down on any questions. And in fact, what she wanted to do was to really drive home her agenda of liberation. And like, it's just interesting because there's no right or wrong. You know, you can look at it and you can say, well, she was wrong, but then also you think, well, if she didn't push for these, for women's, for instance, things like inspectors in factories, this had been begun earlier, but she continued to push it forward so that there would be, the Jean Hôtel members would go to factories to inspect the conditions there for women. And really, like many of the trade unions, they really didn't like it, because they were forced to acknowledge that basically things, you know, weren't there, that there was no childcare provision in the factory, and that nursing mothers weren't able to take time off to go and nurse their babies, because there was, under the laws of the Soviet Union, women were entitled to breaks, half-an-hour breaks every 3 hours to go and nurse their child. They weren't meant to work more than 6 hours a day. So they were able to go and inspect whether the formal equality was becoming real equality. And anyway, that rankled many in the bureaucracy of the party and among the trade unions. And the Jean Hôtel was seen as an annoying nuisance. It was seen as promoting questions that were not as serious as the ones of winning the war, and that it should be put off, these questions should be put off to a time when the society had developed to the stage where there would be enough money to provide these facilities. So anyway, so she continued to push for that agenda. Some of the work she did is work that I've studied myself directly, but I won't go into any detail now because I haven't got the time. But she developed the program of the Jean Hôtel in Central Asia and Azerbaijan, which was extremely interesting and had lots of very good initiatives for women who had formerly been like confined to home and lived, you know, with veils over their faces when they went out on the streets. They were able to set up facilities like community centres and cooperative shops where these women came to and could unveil and could take part in activities and buy their own produce, sell their own produce, be part of political discussions, have doctors' consultations, more or less everything, you know, like everything that a good community centre would have today. In fact, more. You know, these facilities were provided there. Some really remarkable, interesting stuff. Anyway, in 1921, she began to be involved in the opposition to the new economic program, which was going to introduce market forces into the economy. And she led some of the arguments at the debates at the Congress. Was it the 9th Congress? I can't remember the Congress, where that faction was defeated and where the decision was made to ban factions in the party. She went further, and at the next meeting of Comintern, the next Congress of Comintern, she went along to that. And despite the fact that they'd been banned from discussing it, she raised the question in front of the Congress. And there was a lot of anger towards her by Lenin and others. And then following that, she was removed from her position as the head of the Zhenotgel, and she was dispatched abroad. And I think she was also, maybe Tina, the first woman ambassador ever, because she became an ambassador for the Soviet Union to Norway. So she was sent away because of her activities. And in her absence, she was painted as somebody who was basically an advocate for debauchery, that, you know, she had ideas about free love and women, you know, not having to depend on men, etc., etc. And a lot of what she said was presented in such a way that was meant to alienate her, to make her seem as though she was something outside of the movement, that she was basically a danger to the movement. She only ever went back to Russia to work in the movement on one other occasion, when she returned in 1926 to campaign against a new law on the family, where they were making men more responsible for maintenance, spousal maintenance, or children's maintenance. And she went back to campaign for an insurance fund that would be paid into, where women would be able to get whatever they needed for their maintenance of their children or themselves from the state, and not have to look for it from their ex-husbands or the fathers of their children. But she was defeated in that. And then she didn't go back very many times afterwards, except when she was summoned back by Stalin. And whenever she returned, she always thought that this was her end, that she would be the next to be executed. She saw close comrades of hers being executed during the purges. I mean, as they almost all of the Bolsheviks were. And she, I mean, it must have been dreadful. I think the rest of her life was a very sad one, where she watched from afar as those comrades that she had fought with over the years, argued with and worked with, were killed, and where the party that she had fought with and the government that she had been one of the first leaders of turned into a bureaucratic monster, and where the woman question was conclusively defeated. In my view, what Stalin did was took the language of the Zhenotgel, which he closed down in 1930, and used it as a way to provide a cover for measures which were anything but ones that were advantageous for women. So women were seen as both the leader of the revolution in the workplace and on the collective farms, but also as the mother of the revolution. Abortion, which had been legalized in 1920, was banned in 1934, although women continued to have illegal abortions. Divorce was made very difficult, and basically, so, you know, the struggle that had been fought for and had been so successful was manipulated and largely defeated by the bureaucracy. Anyway, so I leave it there. I know I've kind of given you a lot of information. I didn't want to just speak about her on her own, but about the movements that she was involved in. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I think that was a really very interesting period in our history, obviously. So anybody who's lived through that will have experienced more than most of us in a lifetime, in a few short years there. Comrades, if you have any questions or comments, please click raise hand. And I thought I'd get the ball rolling with you and ask you a few more questions. Or have a little discussion, perhaps, a few issues that we've discussed over the years since we've known each other. But I still think it's interesting is the question of women's sections. Is quite disputed, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, it kind of makes sense for women to get together and discuss what needs to be changed and what needs to be achieved, etc. On the other hand, if it's just women, and I think the example you gave was interesting, that Lenin tried to get involved, couldn't go, and so he had a stand in, more or less, or try to get his views across through Inessa Armand, which is a bit dishonest, really. I mean, wouldn't it be better to have him there? And the question that unless men fight with women, it's unlikely that women can achieve that. And on the other hand, as well as, of course, the old Marxist saying, and quite right, unless men fight for the liberation of women, they themselves can never be free. If you participate in somebody's oppression, it makes you a prisoner as well. And isn't that a way to get men involved to fight for women's rights? Would have been to get them involved in those sections, etc. How was that dynamic playing out at that period? What were those discussions even?
Oh, definitely. Well, the example I gave of the conference in 1915, I don't know why there were no men at that. I don't know why Lenin wasn't there. I should look at that, but definitely the Zhenotchel wasn't a woman-only organization. It didn't want to be. And their journal, Kommunistka, had a number of men on its editorial board. Zinoviev was there. Who else? Bukharin, well-known figures.
And Communist International, when you mentioned that was women only, but that was it?
Yeah, that seems to have been. I don't know. Like, I was really sort of just, giving that example as him trying to intervene. And you're right. I don't know why he wasn't able to go to that. Maybe, but I don't know also whether, no, there were men at the Socialist International, Social Women's International meetings, and there were men at the Communist Women's International meetings, which I actually haven't mentioned at all. There were men at that, and men were welcome, and they wanted men to be involved. And they were always, like in Kommunistka, which is the journal of the Zhenotchel, they were always arguing for men to be involved. They wanted them to be involved. Like, it would be so much better to have men arguing for the kinds of things that women were arguing for. It would have given them so much strength. So no, they definitely wanted that. And whether they should have set up a separate organization, I suppose, like I mentioned, that people didn't want to do it for very good reasons at the beginning, because they were afraid that it would become a sectional project and that they would be condemned as feminists, and they were afraid because they didn't want it to be a separate question. They wanted it integrated, but the fact was that they had to do something in the end because it wasn't happening spontaneously. Men in the party were they weren't, like, I think Krupskaya said that men aren't aware of the question in the same way as women are aware of the question. They don't live it, they don't experience it. It has to be raised up for their attention. Now, not all men, but generally that's the case. So she did say that, but there were many. In fact, Nadia Krupskaya, wrote a number of articles in the early years, in not just in the Kommunistka, but in Pravda and Izvestia and other journals, about the importance of men being involved. And she said that it was very important to educate men. So they definitely were aware of that. And in fact, it was one of the problems. It became a huge problem for them that is there something to be done on the women question? They got to do it. They had to do it, So it was like they didn't want to be in that position, but they kind of ended up being ghettoized.
This is, of course, a discussion that is still going on with, black sections, women's section. I mean, that is how do those double oppressed or triple oppressed under capitalism, how can they organize? And it is, I don't think we've quite solved it yet, the socialist movement. It is a tricky one to deal with. also wanted to pick you up on something that perhaps you and I agree on, is the question of feminism, but perhaps not many in the audience, because for most people actually today, even young women, if they're politically astute, they consider themselves feminist. Why do you think that is a problematic term?
Well, I suppose like with feminism, there's different ways to look at it. If being a feminist means I'm an independent woman and I believe myself to be the equal of any man, then absolutely. But the problem with feminism is that it is sectional, and that it sees that women have a unity apart from men, and the way forward is for women to come together as women alone to fight for their rights, and that it's a cross-class movement as well. Now, there is socialist feminism, which obviously isn't cross-class, and so that's maybe a different thing. And I think lots of people would describe themselves as socialist feminists and have a problem with me saying that I'm not a feminist, or that these women, the historical women, weren't feminists. So what I think the problem is that feminism seems to like add on to socialism rather than kind of come from socialism. Do you see what I mean? It's not looking in the same way for men to take up that question. It's like, I don't think men usually are described as feminists. I sort of don't think you can. Well, some men maybe do, but I think the main thing is that I think that communism, Marxism, has within it the approach to this question, which can resolve it through the coming together of men and women and all sections of the working class in a universal struggle. Yeah, I think that feminism can end up going down all sorts of different avenues, and I just think adding feminism to socialism doesn't really do anything for us. I think we should look at socialism itself, and why isn't socialism liberatory? Why isn't it liberatory for women or for Black people? Because it should be. That's what it's meant to be. So, yeah, that's.
Yeah, interesting. And then I was going to ask you about sort of the concrete achievements of the Soviet Union, because that's quite interesting that she was involved in at the beginning. I mean, they backtrack quite a lot. And you mentioned abortion, which was apparently the Soviet Union was the first country to legalize abortion, which is quite something. You think Soviet Union was always, it was quite backward and stuff. It wasn't, and then banned in 33 or 34. The divorce thing is also interesting, because as I understand it, at the beginning, when they legalized divorce, it was also quite revolutionary, as you imagine, and they had a no-fault divorce, and also like a no division of property. So it's sort of you as a woman, because you were working anyway. That was conscription. You had to work. You went to work. You got your vouchers and whatever. You're being looked after by the state, and that if you're working, and that was fine. And then the NEP, the new economic policy, started, war, communism, etc., a bit of free market reinstated, and a lot of women became unemployed, and then got into trouble when they were divorced previously and had nothing from the man, sort of, and that led to some changes as well, apparently, which is interesting that the women were still in that position, and it still happened today, that women were still in the position that divorce and a marriage was a kind of safety net, when it really, really shouldn't be. It should be, for love, whatever. But a lot of women had to consider marriage again in terms of keeping themselves financially stable. Do you know anything about that tension there in the Soviet Union early?
So first you had war communism, and under that, you had the voucher scheme. And when they got rid of church marriage, basically many relationships came into being which were like common law marriages. So there wasn't any legal status for those marriages. And that began to be a problem with the new economic policy, because women had been working previously. So, okay, it was tough, but they were working. Then when the new economic policy came into being and men returned from the war, women were basically sacked en masse from the factories. And although the Genotel tried to kind of maintain their employment by setting up cooperatives and fighting with the labor, what you call them, the labor offices for women to be, labor exchanges for women to have work, it was very difficult. So, and then this other thing happened, which, because women were often living separately, they were in a worse position because they had to look after the children themselves and they had to work. And I think a lot of the housing at the beginning must have been either was taken over from the past, but they were kind of living in these like hostel kind of places. So anyway, Krupskaya mentions this. So if a woman got pregnant, she had no support, and she didn't want to get pregnant. So lots of women didn't want to be pregnant because they wanted to be, we'll say, involved in the new society, or they didn't want to be pregnant because they didn't, because of the hardship or whatever, or they just didn't want to be pregnant because they didn't want to be on their own. So anyway, there was a large incident of abortion in the early years. And then basically the demand for abortion rights came from the second conference second conference which set up the Genotel. And there were a number of doctors who were progressives who had been arguing from 1905 that abortion needed to be legislated for because it was happening anyway and it was very dangerous in the underground. And then so they legalized it. And in fact, it wasn't half as dangerous as they had expected it to be. You could only have an abortion if you had it in a hospital. You had 2 or 3 days in hospital. They performed them all surgically. And then you had some time off work. I think maybe you had 3 weeks off work afterwards. And there was a huge demand for them, okay, that they couldn't cope with. So what they started to do was basically create a priority list, and it functioned like that, but like it just wasn't satisfactory. I mean, there was always this idea, and this is an interesting idea, I think, and even this was among the women themselves, was that abortion was okay in a society which couldn't give women what they needed to live a decent life, which we know in which childcare wasn't socialized, etc., etc., etc. So almost like communism, when communism comes, women won't want abortions anymore, which I think was quite dubious. But but there were some among them, there were some voices that said, no, women aren't, they're not like breeding machines for society, even in the perfect society. So Inessa Armand and Revikin, I think his name was, he was one, there were a couple of people who were saying this, but actually Clara Zetkin was very conservative on the question. But nevertheless, like, it happened. And because it happened, like divorce, because it happened, it became something that people saw as a right for themselves, no matter what reason it no matter what reason was behind it, being introduced. So yeah, I'm wandering off. I know it's just like, it's very complicated in some respects, but really
it changed all the time, didn't it? It was tweaked all the time, etc. And they were trying out things as well, weren't they? They were trying out things. And what about sort of the collective child care and laundry facilities and that? How far did that go, and how liberated were women in the early Soviet Union?
So I think that went really well. Like at the very beginning, there were a lot of canteens. There's figures of the population in St. Petersburg or with Petrograd and Moscow at the very beginning, like something like 90% of the population eating in canteens. but that was during war communism. And I suppose, it made practical sense. That's one of the things as well, is that when then they introduced the new economic policy, the whole kind of culture and attitude in society, which before then had been, it's tough, but we're going forward, we're all together, we'll pool our resources, we go out and support our army and collectivize everything. That was a tough time, but it was a time that felt like it was, a society coming together, a socialized society coming together. When they introduced the new economic policy, it had an impact culturally, where women were basically like losing their jobs, and therefore they were at home and they would be expected to cook. And then, but I think among the workplaces, they continued to fight for nursery and childcare provision, and it continued to exist. And in fact, it became a mainstay of Soviet society under Stalin. Those nurseries continued in the factories, so that continued to work. Yeah, it did. Yeah, because I don't know, like it was a good way of keeping women at work when they did go to work for Stalin. So that continued. And then there were many other things that were good in terms of maternity leave, as I said, abortion, and childcare, medical care, involvement in different political and social organizations. And in fact, the Genotgel, there's a really good article on the Genotgel by Wendy Goldman, where she talks about it being an organization that its members were extremely dedicated to, and they continued to fight for its survival during the 1920s in a way that, would have surprised many people, because they were so looked down on in many ways, because the woman's question was seen by some as being, just so, as I said earlier, a nuisance. But they really believed in it, and they got a great deal from it. And, they fought for it right to the end, until Stalin just said, that's it now, that's over. Yeah. Anyway, so
we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, which I'm going to read out. Diana is asking, what provision was there for women for contraception, if you know that?
Yeah, so contraception was difficult. It seems that maybe at the beginning that there were problems getting things in from Europe. They set up a commission to consider contraception in, I think it was maybe 1922 or something like that. There were like experiments going on with various chemicals to see, if they could produce something that, like the pill, and there was some problem. So condoms, there was some problem with them, like getting the materials or something. Anyway, there weren't very many contraceptives available, but they were arguing for, they wanted them to be available. I read some pieces in Communistica, which was the Genitals journal, which were advocating. I mean, I think everybody agreed more or less that there needed to be contraception, but
preferable to abortion, isn't it?
Preferable to abortion. But there was problems getting it, and there was problems developing it. There was sometimes announced that that contraception was there for women, that they didn't need to have abortions. But these articles that I've read say differently. They say it actually isn't out there. So there was a continuing problem with it. And then there were attitudes that many women were facing from men who were very patriarchal, who would, like one woman wrote in to the journal at one stage and said, well, it's all very well, but my husband, if I get pregnant, he doesn't care about what happens. If I have an abortion, it doesn't matter to him. But if he sees that I have contraception, or I'm going to use contraception, he hits me around the place. He won't allow me to use that. So there were lots of cultural problems for women in being able to adopt that approach. And also there were in behind the kind of idea that women wouldn't need to have abortions under communism, there were concerns about the population plummeting if women used contraception. Not so much contraception, but also contraception. If the birth rate would go down because women weren't having children, they were concerned about that. But I mean, I suppose that was mostly to do with abortion. But nevertheless, there was this idea that in a socialist society, women needed to have children so that the society would have young people to fight for the project. So
it does say something though, isn't it, that women chose to have a lot of abortions. I mean, it does say something about, yes, having to work and maybe enjoying your freedom, but it perhaps also says something that you don't necessarily want to bring children in that kind of, unstable society as well. Must have been difficult.
Yeah. I think they obviously, I mean, because it was unstable, but also like, you can imagine being in a society where you're told you're an equal, but you're not actually an equal. You've made some progress, there's some pressures on, but really it's left to you at the end of the day to do everything.
Well, the same today, isn't it? I mean, that's, we are formally equality, we're formally, the state helps to look after the children, do they? Felicity is asking, and perhaps it would have been good to have Tony in this session, because I'm not sure if you know about this one. What, if any, similarities do you see between the ideas of Russian revolutionary politics or policies and the ideology of the kibbutz? And Tony, if he was here, would have told us that there was nothing progressive about the kibbutz movement at all. It sold itself as progressive, and that's certainly, growing up in Germany, that's what I thought. That's what you've been told. It's a socialist paradise type. Everybody's doing their fair share and being equal, etc. When in fact it was also probably part of the obviously Zionist project. Do you know anything about this, or? I
just know about people that went there and they said it was really good. I mean, there were some things that weren't there, like they looked after the children in the kibbutzes. There was collective care for children of the workers that were there. I just remember somebody telling me about this. But I would say, although it was in a kind of, there were these little islands of progressiveness, were they, within a reactionary society? I would say that nothing is ever completely bad, is it? If they were trying to do those things, then that must be something that you'd note. But overall, obviously, the problem of the persecution of the Palestinians was there in the background, and nobody wanted to deal with that. So
yeah. There's comrades putting questions in the Q&A rather than raising their hands. That's fine. I can read some out in the question here as well. Can you say more about Stalin's counter-revolution on these questions, and when this happened and how? Abortion and those kind of things. I mean, you touched on some of it.
Yeah. Okay. So from around. So there's all kind of different stages. In about so from the Communist Women's International, which I haven't really actually spoken about, but actually there's going to be a book coming up maybe this year or early next year on the conferences of the Communist Women's International. That started to be undermined from about 1924. From the point of view of the Zhenotgel, the problems, I think, really started to arise from about 26. So do you think these problems arose for concrete reasons, like, we're short of workers, or we're short of the population, that's why we have to turn something back? Or is it more in terms of, rolling back democracy and trying to control these various organizations and factions and trying to control women, really? Well, actually, what was fundamentally at the heart of it was the fact that the state said that it was for women's equality, but in reality, it didn't back them when they were in conflict with trade union bureaucrats or factory bosses. It didn't do anything to support them. So in around 26, 27, the Bureau's responsibilities were taken away from them and handed to this or other department. So their work on education, for instance, was taken from them and handed to the agitprop section. then in the trade unions, they were unpopular among some because of the fact that they made these additional demands for women. And they found that some of their their individual organizers in trade unions the positions maybe were removed or, taken away, or they were isolated, frozen out, okay? And they complain about it, nothing was done. Then local, so the Genotgel was a committee of each party organization. So it was of the central committee, and then whatever other, it was in the party, it was connected to the party. So for instance, what would happen, a party organization in Kiev or somewhere, for instance, decided to close down. The Genotgel department said it was a waste of time and that they could take on those questions themselves directly. So they closed it down and there would be no ramifications. So they found themselves basically being wiped off the map. And then they fought back against that, and there was a big battle in 28. But by then, obviously, we'd had the announcement of the first 5-year plan, and things were going to change. In Central Asia, where my project of study was, they did something different. They kind of tried to use the organization to crush the autonomy of the local population through apparently defending women's rights, and destroyed the organization in the process. And then when you look at Kommunistka, their journal, you get an indication of why Stalin closed it down, because they kept arguing, they kept arguing for their rights on abortion. So in 1928, 1929, there were increasing arguments that abortion was unethical and immoral, and that women needed to do their duty by the Soviet Republic. And they were arguing back on that, and there's a number of articles which include discussions with the kind of main top leaders of the departments of motherhood and childhood. And at that point, women were actually seeking abortions more even than before, I would say, because of the imposition of the 5-year plan, and particularly for peasant women, because they were being forced onto collective farms, and society was basically under huge pressure. So more than ever before, women were just like, they couldn't cope. They didn't want to cope with pregnancy. So they were arguing, they were using the pages of the journal to argue. And I think if the journal was saying it, then the meetings were saying it. And therefore, it was an organization which was fighting back and was critical of the leadership, and was relatively autonomous. As I said at the beginning, they saw themselves as a what's the word, not a tool of the party, but you know what I mean, to go out and recruit women to the party, but it became more and more a voice for women within the party, and that was something that Stalin was not going to have. Yeah. So when he closed it down in March 1930, the announcement was that there was no more need for it because women's equality had been won in large part, and that the party itself would take up this question rather than it being left to the women on their own. So, but
didn't quite happen like that, though, I'm guessing. Paul makes a really good comment in the chat, which I'm going to read out. The Bolshevik Revolution was always assumed to be the harbinger of the world revolution. It was never thought that a backward country like Russia could survive on its own. The failure of the revolutions in the West isolated the Bolsheviks and led to ideas of socialism in one country, whose figurehead was Stalin. Quite right. I think that would sum up your position as well, and mine. And onto Stalinism then, and listening to how you describe her, and that she came back and kept arguing, etc., and wasn't executed is quite interesting, isn't it? Did she speak out much when she was abroad in the 30s, 40s, 50s. I mean, she only died in 56, I believe.
Yeah, she died just before him, didn't she?
So she wasn't a campaigner against Stalin or anything like that.
She didn't, no.
Did she support Stalinism? I mean, we had a really interesting session with Clara Zetkin by Ben Lewis, and he described, that, I mean, you have to get your head around it. You've worked your ass off to get this revolution off the ground, and it looked really good at the beginning, and you put everything into it and everything. And then, of course, it slowly changes into something else, and then it's opposite. Where do you, at what stage, can you turn away and say, actually, this is not socialism anymore? And, Clara Zetkin never really made that break, and she supported Stalin and tried to, walk a very fine line there, but didn't quite succeed. How was Kollontai dealing with the degeneration and then turning into opposite of the Soviet Union?
Well, she wrote a couple of short novels at the beginning, which were Love of the Worker Bees, and there's another one, I'm sure that number of people in the chat will know of them, which were critical, without being directly politically critical, but when you read them, you can see what she's trying to say. But she didn't raise any campaign. So she was in the diplomatic service. So obviously, officially, she had to agitate for it. And I think, I don't want to make excuses for her, but I think she was isolated and very afraid. And I think when she saw what was happening, she worried that if she was to say something, that it would affect those people that were left behind. And I'd say that she just collapsed as an individual. Like when you see, I have a book there about Lenin's sisters, which is a really interesting book. And there's a picture on the front cover of Lenin's sister, Maria, and Nadia Krupskaya going into a conference in the 1940s or something like that. And their women are older, but they just look beaten. I mean, I think at the beginning with Stalin that there was a sense that it was going to be the continuity, that it was the center. He was going to keep the party together and stop all the fighting that had been going on in the late part of the 1920s. And there was hope that would happen. And the need to kind of defend the party against splitters or whatever. But of course, then after that, then things got very different and you weren't able to say anything. So, I don't know. I mean, there's been some people who've been critical of Krupskaya because he didn't kill her, or sorry, Krupskaya, he didn't kill Krupskaya either. He made her the official widow, which was very convenient. So shut her up that way. But with Kollontai, there's been criticisms of her for not speaking out and for the fact that he decided not to kill her. But I don't know, like I sort of feel, what can you say,
Absolutely. It's kind of you look at a film like Reds or something, you think, oh man, I wish I'd been there. I think, it must have been one of the most exciting periods ever, well, it was one of the most exciting periods ever, but then yes, it did turn into something quite different, and it put a lot of people in very difficult positions, including Krupskaya, yes, at Kollontai, Clara Zetkin, etc. Okay, one last question then from Christine. What are the lessons for the left today? That's an interesting one. Wide open. I mean, on the women's question and the sections, we've talked about that. That was interesting. I mean, can we learn, what can we take away perhaps from the early Soviet experience and from that struggle that, is still important today and continues to inspire?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that it's really good to know our history, and whether you call it feminist or not is the secondary question in some ways, if you mean by feminism, women's liberation, and we can talk about that. But I think to know our history and to know that there was this movement from the later part of the 1890s right through to, 1930. And to see that movement and to see what it achieved and what it was able to achieve, I think is very inspiring, despite all the difficulties that they faced. And to know that you know, that the women's movement didn't just start in the 1960s, that questions of abortion and other questions, like in Germany, for instance, in 1922, there was a resolution passed to instruct the fraction of the Communist Party of Germany to demand, you know, an overthrow of the ban on abortion. And the words in it were like, women have to determine their own, have to have bodily autonomy. So women's right to choose was being raised there. So, you know, like to see that this movement did exist and had like the issues that were problems for them, many of them are issues that we still have today. So some of the questions that they struggled with are questions that we still have to work out, you know, involvement of men and what it is, and, you know, in terms of a joint enterprise, what it is, all those questions. So I think the history is the most important thing for us to know about. And then I think the second thing is what could be done when they took an initiative, because I had always been told that nothing really had happened, that there'd been formal equality, but that it couldn't go any further than that because the resources weren't there. Mm-hmm. And then when I studied it, it was like, you know, it was like finding buried treasure, because it wasn't just like that. They had done lots of different things, and some quite amazing initiatives had been taken that had been buried really for many years. Now in academia, they knew about it, but have taken a different approach, I think, that we would take. Like, we would be critical, of course, as I have been, of the Communist Party and, you know, all of the different problems that arose because of the fact that they didn't fully take the question seriously. But we wouldn't use that to say, therefore, that shows that socialism is hopeless, which is what happens in academic circles. A lot of the time, we would use it as a way of understanding, you know, what we need to do to resolve these questions. So I would say that we should learn more about it, and that, like the publication of books on the communist women's movement later this year or early next year, things like that will be an enormous boost to us, I think. Yeah.
I think we'll have you on for that one again if you're interested in it. That sounds interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much, Anne, for joining us. I think that's a really eye-opening look at the particular period of our history, and you know, learning from history also means learning from mistakes that were made, so that we don't continue making the same mistakes. Join us next week, please, when a young American comrade will introduce to us Lucy Parsons, who was a American anarcho-syndicalist, Black woman, very strong leader in the industrial workers movement, Workers of the World movement. Should be very interesting. I know nothing about her, and that could be another eye-opening session. Comrades, if you are interested in presenting somebody from our past or present even to the rest of the audience, please let us know. Get in touch, info@labourleft.org. We're always looking for comrades to you know, study a particular issue and introduce a particular inspiring person from our history to the rest of us. Thank you very much, comrades.
So much. Thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed it. It was great.
Good. Glad, so do we. Christine, yes, more women please for these meetings. How about you, comrade? You could study somebody perhaps and introduce somebody to us. Thank you, comrades. Have a good evening, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Solidarity. Yeah. Bye. Bye. I'll close out there, Sheena.
There you go. Bye.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.